All she asked for was $50, 0 cents, for her granddaughter's medicine. He gave it, and it was only at home that he realized who she had been to him as a child. That encounter would overturn everything he knew about himself. Subscribe so you don't miss new stories. Write in the comments, where are you watching us from? The wind pressed in from the lake, sharp and unrelenting, as the morning traffic moved like a mechanical river through downtown Chicago. It was the kind of cold that bit through gloves and wool and settled deep in bone, the kind of cold that made people walk faster, heads down, eyes forward, as if acknowledgement alone might cost too much warmth. Victor Lowry didn't notice, or rather, he noticed in the way a man might notice that he had left a light on somewhere, distantly, without much concern. He adjusted his scarf with one hand while the other pressed a phone against his ear, listening with practiced disinterest as a junior associate rattled off updates about a building permit delay in Evanston. His sleek coat cut a clean figure against the gray air, his polished shoes tapping smartly against the salted pavement. Around him, city workers salted sidewalks, buses coughed diesel into the slush, and neon pharmacy signs blinked half-heartedly into the daylight. Victor, partner at one of the most sought-after architectural firms in the city, barely registered any of it. His world was one of glass and angles, decisions and margins. He was known for clean designs, ruthless efficiency, and a temperament as cold and modern as the buildings he commissioned. When he ended the call, his path veered toward the entrance of a small neighborhood pharmacy, his mind already spinning with scheduling options and budget revisions. But just before he reached the door, something shifted. A presence, more felt than seen. An interruption in the symmetry of his world. To his left, standing just outside the pharmacy beneath the overhang, was an old woman. She was dressed in layers, none of them warm enough. Her coat an aged wool with frayed cuffs and buttons that didn't match. Her knit hat was faded, the edges of it damp with melting snow. In one gloved hand she held a white cane, tipped with red, tapping lightly in a slow, familiar rhythm on the concrete. She turned her head as he approached, though her gaze missed him entirely. "Sir," she said, her voice quiet, yet with a roundness that carried, "can you spare $50? I need to buy medicine for my granddaughter." Victor paused, his hand still mid-reach for the door handle. He looked at her fully now. She was clearly blind. Her eyes were milky, not just unfocused, but covered with the unmistakable haze of time and illness. Her face was deeply lined, but the set of her mouth was firm. She didn't tremble or shrink. There was no placard, no outstretched cup, no dramatic gesturing. Just the cane, the coat, and her voice. $50, not 5, not change, 50. It tripped his alarms instantly. The phrasing, the location, the specificity. It reeked of manipulation. He'd heard stories. Hell, he'd seen it with his own eyes. People spinning sob stories with surgical precision, aiming right at soft hearts and guilty wallets, especially during the holidays or the colder months, especially in front of drugstores. He tilted his head, studying her. She wasn't performing. She wasn't crying or pleading. If anything, she looked tired. Not just in the way the elderly often appeared tired, but in the way someone looks when life has been whittled down to a single priority and they're barely keeping it together. Victor narrowed his eyes. "What kind of medicine?" he asked, his tone already clipped, more reflex than rudeness. "Antibiotics," she said simply, "and fever reducer. She's sick, sir. She's all I have." He looked past her toward the pharmacy. A warm blast of heat spilled every time the door opened, and people went in and out, not noticing the old woman standing inches from them. She had chosen this place carefully, or maybe out of necessity. Either way, she wasn't chasing anyone down. She stood still, a figure of quiet persistence, speaking only when someone came near. Still, $50. Victor checked his watch. He had a meeting in an hour and needed to prepare. He should go in, buy his allergy prescription, and move on. He didn't have time for this. And yet, he didn't move. There was a stubborn flicker in the woman's bearing, not desperation, something else, something that unnerved him because he recognized it. Pride, perhaps, wounded but intact. "What's your name?" he asked. "Rufina," she said. "Rufina May." He didn't recognize it. Of course he didn't. Why would he? He knew hundreds of names, clients, developers, board members. But this wasn't a name from his world. She angled her head slightly toward him, waiting, though she no longer asked. "And your granddaughter?" he asked, before he realized he was speaking. "Layla," she said, 10 years old. Fever started 2 nights ago. It's worse today. She couldn't get out of bed." Victor exhaled sharply, irritated with himself. This was ridiculous. What was he going to do? Follow her home like some amateur detective? Demand medical records and a tour of the refrigerator before handing over a few bills? But then something unexpected left his lips. "Take me there," he said. Rufina didn't react immediately. For a moment, Victor thought she hadn't heard him, but then she gave the smallest nod, adjusting her cane and turning slightly to the side. "Are you sure?" she asked. "I don't give money without knowing where it goes," he replied. "Show me." She didn't argue. She simply turned, slowly, her cane sweeping, and began walking toward the corner bus stop. Victor followed, not entirely sure why. The ride south was quiet. The bus was half full, filled with bundled strangers, the windows fogged from breath and body heat. Rufina sat near the front, her hands folded over her cane, her posture still proud despite the slope of her shoulders. Victor sat across from her, watching the city pass by in a blur of gray and brick and graffiti. He didn't know what he was looking for. Signs of a scam? A mistake? A truth he wasn't ready to believe? It was only when they disembarked 3 stops later and began the walk down a side street lined with crumbling row houses and vacant lots that Victor began to feel the weight of something shift. The air smelled different here, damp with rot, tinged with diesel and old cooking grease. Trash cans overflowed. A cat darted beneath a stoop. At the base of a 3-story walk-up, Rufina paused. "3rd floor," she said. There was no elevator. Victor steadied her as she slowly made her way up the narrow, groaning steps. Her hand found the railing with practiced ease. He realized with a jolt that she had done this climb many times, blind and alone. She unlocked the door with a worn brass key. Inside, the apartment was dim and quiet. A radiator hissed in the corner, but the air was still cold. The living room was small, barely furnished. A sagging couch, a coffee table held together by duct tape. On the far wall, childish drawings were taped in a crooked line. Flowers, suns, a stick figure labeled "Me plus Grandma." In the corner, curled under a stack of mismatched blankets, lay a girl. Her skin was flushed, her lips dry. She didn't stir when they entered. "She hasn't eaten since yesterday," Rufina said, kneeling slowly beside her. "Water, mostly. I tried to bring her to the clinic, but—" She gestured helplessly to her cane. Victor didn't speak. He didn't need to. He had seen enough. He stepped back out into the hallway, pulled out his phone, and made 3 quick stops: pharmacy, grocery, space heater. When he returned, he moved with quiet efficiency, setting medicine on the counter, checking expiration dates, opening soup cans. He didn't try to comfort. He simply did what needed to be done. Rufina murmured thanks, but he barely heard it. His mind was elsewhere, a strange buzzing behind his ears. He left without saying goodbye. That night, in the warmth of his high-rise apartment, Victor couldn't eat. The city glittered beneath him, cars moving like fireflies. He poured himself a glass of scotch, but it sat untouched. Instead, he went to the bookshelf in the corner, pulled out an old photo album, and began to flip. There, halfway through, was a picture he hadn't looked at in years. A boy, himself at 6 or 7, grinning toothlessly, perched on the lap of a woman in a dark blue dress. Her arms were around him. Her eyes were kind, her smile tired but warm. He hadn't thought of her in decades. Her name had been Rufina. Not May, just Rufina, as far as he had known. His nanny, his protector, the only soft voice in a house made of rules and distance. And today, on a slushy sidewalk in Chicago, she had stood before him, blind, cold, and asking for $50. Not for herself, for a child. just as she once stood for him. The memory of the photograph stayed with Victor long after he closed the album. It clung to him through the rest of the night, through the low hum of traffic far below his penthouse windows, through the shifting shadows cast by streetlights and sleepless thoughts. That small boy in the photo, grinning, wrapped in the arms of a woman he once trusted without question, seemed both impossibly distant and uncomfortably close. She had been a constant presence during the coldest years of his life, and now she lived in a crumbling walk-up with a sick child and a broken heater. He didn't sleep, not really. He drifted in and out, half sitting on the edge of his bed with a blanket pulled around his shoulders, staring into the dark. At dawn, when the first gray light crept across the skyline, he was already dressed. He called no one, messaged no one. He simply picked up his keys and left the apartment without breakfast, without purpose except one. By mid-morning, he was standing again in front of the building on South Laveth Street, the wind pressing harder now, as if urging him back to his rightful world. But he didn't leave. He climbed the stairs, this time more slowly, absorbing every groan of the wood, every chipped edge on the railing. When he knocked gently on the door, it was answered not by Rufina, but by the little girl herself. Layla blinked up at him, her face still pale, her lips slightly chapped. She was wrapped in a sweater 3 sizes too big, the sleeves bunched around her wrists. Her eyes, though dull with fever, carried a clarity that startled him. She did not smile. She simply stepped aside to let him in. Inside, the room was warmer than it had been yesterday, thanks to the new heater humming in the corner. The blankets on the couch had been straightened. A cup of tea sat cooling on the coffee table. Rufina was seated in a worn armchair, her cane resting beside her, her head turned toward the sound of his steps. "You came back," she said softly. Victor nodded, then realized the gesture was useless. "I did," he said. He hadn't brought anything this time, no groceries, no medicine, just himself, and a truth he hadn't yet dared to speak. He looked at her, at the slope of her shoulders, the set of her hands. He tried to reconcile the woman in front of him with the one in his memory, the voice that had once shushed his nightmares, the arms that had lifted him after scraped knees, the presence that had made a cold house feel bearable. "You were my nanny," he said at last. Rufina didn't flinch. She nodded once, slowly. "Victor Lowry," she murmured, almost to herself. "I thought I recognized your voice, but I didn't want to presume." The room went quiet, the only sounds the low hiss of the heater and the distant bark of a dog outside. Victor lowered himself onto the edge of the couch, feeling the weight of years pressing in from all sides. "You took care of me," he said. "I was a child, and you were always there." "I remember," Rufina said. "You were quiet, always building things with your hands, blocks, pillows, once even canned food. Your father said you were wasting time, but I knew better." Victor swallowed hard. It had been so long since anyone had spoken of his childhood without bitterness or cold analysis. He looked toward Layla, who had perched herself at the other end of the couch, legs tucked under her. "She's all I have," Rufina continued. "Her mother, my daughter, died 3 years ago, a heart condition no one caught in time. Layla came to live with me after that. I was already losing my sight, but she never left." Victor looked at the girl again. She was watching him now, her eyes unreadable. He thought of his own childhood, of the emptiness that had filled their enormous house like fog. He had never known what it meant to be someone's all. Rufina didn't ask for anything more. She never did. But Victor felt it in the air, the unspoken weight of survival. The heater had made the room bearable, but not safe. The medicine had brought the fever down, but not the threat. This was a home made of threads, frayed and thinning. He left after an hour, promising to return. This time, when he stepped out onto the street, he had a plan. That afternoon, a moving van arrived at the building. It didn't draw attention. The neighborhood had seen its share of furniture on sidewalks and back seats filled with bags. But this time, the direction was reversed. With gentle care and without fanfare, Victor helped Rufina and Layla pack what little they had. A box of books, a stack of neatly folded clothes, a shoebox of photographs, a few toys. Layla carried a small stuffed rabbit with one ear chewed, hugging it tightly to her chest. Victor brought them to his building on the north side, a sleek tower of glass and steel with a doorman and a heated garage. The contrast was staggering. Layla stared up at the high ceilings, the polished floors, the quiet lighting. She didn't say a word. Rufina, for her part, moved with grace, her cane tapping softly as she navigated unfamiliar territory with dignity. The guest room had been prepared. Clean sheets, warm lights, fresh towels folded like they were waiting to be unfolded by someone who mattered. Victor stood back, watching as Layla explored with cautious fingers and Rufina ran her hands over the surface of a desk. That evening, he cooked dinner. Or tried to. The pasta was overdone, and the sauce tasted too sharp, but Layla ate it without complaint. Rufina complimented the effort, then added with a wry smile that he'd always been better with building blocks than with boiling water. Afterward, Layla curled up on the couch with a book Victor had found in a box marked Kids section. Rufina sat near the window, her fingers resting lightly on the fabric of her skirt, listening to the city through the glass. Victor watched them both, a strange warmth blooming behind his ribs. He didn't recognize the feeling at first. It had been too long, but as he sat in his armchair, sipping tea that was quickly growing cold, he understood. He was home, for the first time in years, not in architecture, not in design, not in status, but in presence, in meaning. That night, he couldn't sleep again, but not from restlessness. He wandered into the guest hallway and stood for a while outside the door, listening. Inside, Layla's breathing was steady. Rufina was humming softly, something simple and familiar, the same tune she used to hum when she thought no one was listening. He had fallen asleep to that sound more nights than he could count. It brought tears to his eyes now, unbidden. He returned to his room and sat at his desk. He wrote a note to his assistant, canceling all meetings for the following day. Then he opened a folder titled Estate Planning and stared at it for a long time. The next morning, as the sun crept slowly over the frozen city, Victor rose early. He made coffee, strong, imperfect, and stood by the stove, warming his hands against the mug. When Rufina entered the kitchen, he poured her a cup without a word. She accepted it with a nod of thanks, her movements unhurried. "I want you to stay," he said. She didn't respond immediately. She sipped her coffee, then tilted her head slightly, as if weighing the shape of his voice. "For a while?" she asked. "For as long as you want." There was silence between them, but it wasn't empty. Victor didn't yet know what came next. He didn't know how to navigate guardianship laws or school registration or the unspoken questions that would follow. But he knew one thing with clarity. This was not a debt. It was not an obligation. It was a homecoming. Later that day, Layla sat beside him as they scrolled through pictures of schools nearby. She didn't say much, but she pointed at one with a playground that curved in a bright loop. When he asked if she liked it, she nodded once. He turned to Rufina and asked what else they needed. She smiled gently, her sightless eyes turning toward the sound of his breath. Only what love already brought. And with that, the smallest thread became a bond. Not of blood, but of memory, of care, of voices that once comforted in the dark, finding their way back to one another. And it was only beginning. It didn't happen all at once. The transformation was slow, quiet, and oddly undramatic. It began with breakfast. The first morning after their move into Victor's apartment, Rufina sat at the dining table, her cane resting against the chair, her fingers gently grazing the edge of the porcelain plate Victor had placed in front of her. She took in the smell of scrambled eggs and toast, felt the warmth of the ceramic cup in her hands, and nodded her approval before tasting a bite. Layla, wrapped in one of Victor's oversized sweaters, ate in silence, but with more appetite than she had shown in days. Victor watched them both from across the table, his coffee growing cold again as his thoughts wandered, not with worry, but with something softer, something unfamiliar. He was discovering the rhythm of living with others again, or perhaps for the first time. The flat that once echoed with nothing but his own steps now pulsed gently with the murmur of voices, the click of utensils, the thud of small feet on hardwood. Layla's presence was light but grounding. She wasn't chatty. She had grown up with caution, not entitlement. But she asked questions about the view, about his work, about the books on his shelf, and Victor, who had spent most of his adult life giving answers only when required, found himself wanting to respond, to offer, rather than withhold. In the evenings, he began reading aloud. At first, it was children's books, ones he borrowed from the local library or found in online catalogs. But gradually, Layla's requests became more varied. Stories about cities, people, questions about why buildings looked the way they did, why bridges didn't fall. Victor, amused, shifted naturally into teacher mode. One night, without thinking, he pulled out one of his old architecture texts and began explaining the difference between Romanesque and Gothic arches. Layla listened, wide-eyed and curled into the corner of the couch, and Rufina, sitting nearby with her hands folded, smiled faintly and said, "There's the boy I knew." The comment lodged in Victor's chest like a pebble dropped in still water. He didn't answer right away. He closed the book, leaned back, and stared at the ceiling as a flood of memory came rushing in. It wasn't just that Rufina had been his nanny, it was that she had been his only witness. She had been there the day his father smashed a model he'd spent 3 weeks building, calling it a waste of time. She had been there the first time he tried to hide a school award because he feared the mockery of seeming soft. She had been there when his mother forgot his birthday 2 years in a row, offering him her own kind of celebration: hot cocoa, a candle, and a story whispered just for him. And then, one day, she was gone. He had come home from school, dropped his backpack at the door, and searched the rooms where she usually waited, but there was only silence. The maid told him she had left. No explanation, no goodbye. Just absence. It had bruised something in him, something that hardened slowly into stone over time. He never asked his father. He didn't dare. And by the time he could have, he no longer cared to. But now, as Rufina sat in his home, humming while folding towels with expert hands, as Layla slept down the hall in a bed she didn't yet believe she had the right to call her own, Victor realized the story was not done. There was more to understand, and more still to say. One night, as the snow began to fall again outside, thick and slow and almost beautiful, he asked, "Did you leave?" Rufina paused. She was sitting near the fire, a cup of tea in her lap, the flames flickering against the gentle planes of her face. She didn't turn toward him right away, but when she did, her expression was open, without bitterness. "Your father let me go," she said. "Said you were too old for a nanny. Said I was filling your head with sentiment." Victor nodded, unsurprised but still sickened. "I tried to write you," she continued, "but the letters came back, no forwarding address. After that, I didn't know where you went, and truthfully, I had to survive. My own family needed me." He said nothing for a moment. Then, "I looked for you, once, years later, but I didn't know your last name or where you might have gone." "You found me anyway," she said, her voice calm. "Not until it was too late," he replied. Rufina reached for his hand. Her fingers were cool, the skin thin, but her grip was steady. "Love isn't late," she said. "It just needs a place to land." That night, Victor sat at his desk with the cassette tape she had handed him earlier that day. It had been tucked into an envelope, unlabeled, save for his name written in pen, the handwriting old-fashioned and a little shaky. He didn't know what to expect as he inserted the tape into the small portable player he had to dig out of storage. But when her voice came through, low, melodic, narrating a children's story he hadn't heard since he was 6, his throat closed. He remembered this one, a tale about a boy who got lost in a forest and found his way home by listening to the wind. It had terrified and comforted him in equal measure. Back then, he believed in monsters and magic, in secret messages in tree bark, and in the power of a steady voice to guide him out of the dark. Now, he listened as that same voice reminded him of a version of himself he thought had vanished, a boy who had trusted, who had believed someone would come when he called. The next morning, he asked Rufina what else she had kept. She smiled, mysterious, and showed him a box she had stored in her closet. Inside were things he hadn't seen in decades. Drawings he'd made, small notes he had scribbled for her and left on her pillow, even a paper crown from a forgotten birthday party she had held just for him. Layla watched them quietly, her eyes flicking between them, absorbing everything. She had not yet asked who Victor truly was to her grandmother or to herself. She didn't need to. The answer was unfolding around her. Later that week, Victor found himself sitting in a coffee shop near his office, staring at an email from a private school administrator. He had begun the process of enrolling Layla, testing, interviews, evaluations. He wasn't sure how it would go, but he had resolved one thing. She would not grow up believing the world was a place of cold margins and empty rooms. He also began making calls to a legal firm specializing in family guardianship and estate planning. It was time to name beneficiaries. Time to leave more than money behind. At home, the changes were subtle but steady. Layla began leaving her shoes by the door without being asked. Rafina insisted on helping with the cooking and was slowly teaching Victor the difference between adding salt and seasoning with intent. He burned fewer meals. He started to remember what laughter sounded like when it was real. One evening, after a particularly long day, Victor came home to find the living room rearranged. Nothing drastic, just the placement of a chair closer to the window, a throw blanket over the couch, a vase of dried flowers on the mantel. "It feels warmer," he said aloud. "It feels lived in," Rafina replied. The words stayed with him as he went to bed, passing by Layla's room where he paused once more. She was asleep, her stuffed rabbit tucked under her arm, the window cracked slightly to let in the night air. She had drawn a picture that now hung on her wall, a house with 3 figures standing out front, holding hands. One tall, one stooped, one small. No labels, no titles, just shapes of belonging. Victor stood there for a long while. He thought of concrete and steel, of the buildings he had shaped with precision and pride. But none of them, he realized now, had ever been a home. This was different. This was memory, not preserved in glass or framed in accolades, but lived, reshaped, and reborn through presence, through choice, through the quiet, everyday courage of showing up again and again, even after the years had stretched too far and the losses had multiplied. Here, in this apartment that used to echo with silence, memory had returned. And with it, something like grace. There was something about winter light, its pale, watery quality, the way it softened even the sharpest architecture, that made Victor pause more often now, not just on his morning walks or during the quiet moments before a meeting, but in the ways that mattered. He noticed the texture of a woolen scarf laid across a chair, the shape of Layla's handwriting when she practiced new words in her notebook, the sound of Rafina's cane tapping in rhythm against polished hardwood. All these details had once been ambient noise in the life he built, distant as the hum of the city beyond his windows. Now they were markers, threaded signs of life, signs of something returned and something healed. The apartment had shifted from pristine showroom to layered space, still elegant, but touched with small imperfections that made it real. A tea ring on the coffee table, a folded blanket on the arm of the couch, a single toy car left under the dining room chair. Victor didn't rush to remove them. Instead, he found himself lingering, picking up the car not to scold or hide it, but to feel its weight in his hand. Layla had been admitted to the school they'd chosen together. The transition was slow but full of promise. She was behind in some subjects, especially math, but well ahead in reading. Her teachers noted her silence with care, not concern. They said she observed more than she spoke, and when she did speak, she asked questions with weight. "She listens like someone twice her age," one of them said during a parent conference. Victor had smiled at that. Not out of pride exactly, but a quieter recognition. Layla's silence was not emptiness, it was calculation. She was building her own blueprint for understanding the world. And like him, she didn't offer much until she was sure it would matter. At home, Rufina's presence remained constant. Though her eyes no longer saw, her other senses were sharp and intimate. She could tell when Victor entered the room by the subtle shift in air or the faint brush of his coat as he passed. She heard Layla's footsteps from across the apartment and could tell by the rhythm what kind of day the child had had. More than once, she caught Victor in the act of quietly pacing through the kitchen in the middle of the night, unable to sleep. She would appear in the doorway, silently, like a familiar ghost, and say, "Tea or scotch?" And Victor would answer without resistance, "Whichever you're having." The routine became comfort. Comfort became something close to joy. But life, Rufina always said, did not offer peace without cost. It started with her hands. Victor first noticed it on a Saturday morning when they were folding laundry. She dropped a towel, then another. Her fingers, always so precise and nimble, missed the corner of a sheet and fumbled with a pillowcase seam. She chuckled to herself, brushing it off. "Just clumsy today," she said. But Victor watched. A few days later, she missed the edge of a table entirely and knocked over her teacup. It shattered on the floor, tea seeping into the rug. Rufina didn't speak for several moments. She simply stood there, motionless, her expression unreadable. Victor crouched down, cleaned up the mess, and said nothing. The next morning, he made her an appointment. She protested gently, but he insisted. The neurologist's office was quiet and smelled faintly of antiseptic and lavender. Rufina sat in the examination room with perfect composure, her cane resting beside her. Victor stayed in the hallway for most of it, but he heard the quiet questions, the tapping of tools against skin, the murmur of explanations. Later, in the car, Rufina said nothing. Her silence was different now, heavier, more thoughtful. Layla was at school. The apartment waited, clean and warm and full of small living things. "They think it's neuropathy," she said finally. "Degenerative. Could be from years of untreated diabetes, or something else. They won't know more until the next round of tests." Victor nodded, gripping the steering wheel. His knuckles went white. He didn't speak. "I've lived long enough," Rufina added, almost lightly. Victor didn't respond. He couldn't. The idea of her not being in his home, of her absence filling the air the way it once had when he was 10 years old, was unthinkable. It tightened something behind his ribs. "I can still feel," she said. "Even if my fingers are slower, I still remember what my hands were capable of." When they got home, she asked to sit in the kitchen with him while he cooked. He handed her the carrots to peel and watched her carefully. She worked slowly, methodically. One slip, then another. She set the peeler down. "I think I'll just talk," she said. Victor nodded. He finished the carrots in silence. That evening, while Layla did her homework and Rufina rested, Victor went to his office. He took out the design sketches he had been working on, blueprints for a new civic center his firm had been bidding on for months. He looked at the lines. They were perfect, balanced, cold. He took a blank sheet and began again. This time, he sketched not for approval or prestige, but for Rufina. He drew the apartment as it had become, the way the armchair sat near the window, the child's drawings on the refrigerator, the teacups mismatched, one with a small chip that still held tea just fine. When he was finished, he felt something settle inside him. Not completion, but direction. Days passed. Rufina's hands worsened, but she never let the fears show. She adapted. Victor installed voice-controlled devices, softer lighting, easier grips on doors and cabinets. She joked that he was turning the apartment into a spaceship. But he saw the way her shoulders relaxed with each adjustment. One afternoon, while Layla was out on a field trip, Victor found Rufina in the armchair, humming softly. He sat beside her, saying nothing at first. She stopped humming and turned her head. "There's something you've wanted to ask me," she said. He hesitated. Then, "Do you regret it? Staying with us?" She smiled. "You were never a burden," she said. "Not when you were little, not now. You're the reason I believed kindness would come back around." He looked down at his hands. They had built towers and earned awards, but now they felt small. "You gave me a place to be loved before I even understood the word," he said. "You're the reason I know how to offer it back." Rufina reached for his hand. Though her fingers trembled now, her grip was still firm. Then we've both done what we came here to do, she said. That evening, they cooked together, slowly, with patience. Leila set the table. They lit candles, not for ceremony, but for warmth. At dinner, Layla told them she had drawn a new picture at school. It was a house again, but this time with 4 windows, one for each of them. She pointed to the smallest figure on the page. "That's Grandma," she said. "She's in the kitchen. She's making the best soup." "And that?" Victor asked, pointing to the tallest figure. "That's you," she said. "You're holding the door open." He felt his throat tighten. "And what am I doing?" Layla asked, eyes bright. "You're looking at the sky," Rufina said softly. "You're seeing what comes next." And somehow, in that simple sentence, everything made sense. The past with its fractures, the present with its hard-earned peace, and the future, unfolding in a child's drawing, in the sound of laughter, in the memory that lived not only in minds, but in hands that remembered, hands that had comforted, built, reached out. Even when the eyes could no longer see, the hands carried what mattered. And that, Victor thought, was how you built a home. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more, watch the next one right here, and share this video with someone who needs to hear it.